Oh, baby, we are back at it again. Basically like a week out from the Stage 1 Major, back on LAN. And today, we're going over some massive takeaways from the best teams in the game after the final week of qualifier matches before this Stage 1 Major. So we have a ton to talk about with the literal best teams in the league. Without further ado, let's get right into this one. Let's go. All right, so let's start with probably the biggest storylines of this whole weekend, the massive upsets of the Surge and Toronto. Both teams, debatably the two best teams in the CDL going into this tournament, or at least the teams everybody thought were the two best teams, both lost both their matches, which is insane. So off the rip, the Surge, they lost 3-0 to the Florida Mutineers. There was some controversy in the series though, because Florida and the Surge had to replay the first map on Bocage. And that's where the most questions probably come up here for the series, because Sib dominated on that first round on Bocage, but then Vivid disconnected for about maybe 30 seconds to a minute or so. And then he joined back in and they actually finished the map. So we saw Surge absolutely dominate them in that first map, and Sib was frying. And then they have to replay the map because of the disconnect eventually. And we never really saw that dominant Sib again the rest of the weekend. I mean, they end up losing 3-0 to Florida, then they lose 3-1 to London. And Sib didn't play well in either of those series. And without a doubt, his worst series of the year was against Florida. And they squared up against the Mutineers on Berlin. For sure, Florida's best S&D map. They are now 2-0 on Berlin and 0-4 on all the other maps combined. So they end up losing the S&D, then they drop the control and lose 3-0. And then you head into the London series. And again, London played incredible. So don't get me wrong here, but like you'd expect it to be even more competitive than it was, with how good Seattle's looked at this point. But after this weekend, if you look back on Seattle's stage, it's honestly not as good as you'd really think about it or want it to be. So like they beat NYSL 3-0. Then they won round 11 in a Ninja Diffuse against Toronto. Then they won round 11 game 5 against Minnesota with the 2v1 or the 1v2 from Accuracy. And then they lose 3-0 to Florida and lose 3-1 to London. 2 rounds away from being 1-4. So the question is whether or not we're going to see a better Sib and a better Pred on LAN at the Stage 1 Major, whether or not we're going to see Seattle bounce back, or have we seen the best of the Surge? To be honest, I'm a little bit worried. I really am. I'm not convinced we're going to see a better Surge than what we saw at the kickoff, at least for a little while. It could be a situation where teams start to figure them out a little bit as teams have gotten a little bit better inside control, inside of Tuscan Hardpoint, which was where Seattle was making their bread in those early matches. So even though we saw a lot of good things from them in these series still, where you see that flashes of incredible gun skill from Pred and Sib, and even Mac had some amazing moments in this series. And Accuracy looked great on that Berlin S&D against London. So there's still these like really impressive things that they're doing. Are they in championship form right now? It doesn't seem like it. And if I was doing a power rankings video, I'd probably have them at like 5 right now. I'm just overall a little bit nervous. So now as for Toronto, they're in a weird spot too. Obviously they lost both their matches. So they went 0-2, losing to OpTic 3-0 and then to LA Thieves 3-1. Of course, we'll talk about the OpTic series a little bit more in a bit. But I mean, come on. I mean, the F8 thing was obviously a massive deal with Shotzi using the F8 stabilizer in the first 2 maps. And then Toronto pulled it out on map 3. They lose the control. So it was just a weird, wild series with the GA debate. Overall, I just really don't care that much. I mean, yes, it affected the game. And yeah, Shotzi played really, really well map 1 and 2, but I think it would have changed the outcome of the series considering OpTic was literally just outplaying them. I mean, the S&D was clinical from them, and it was a really solid performance on Bocage. And you go to the control and they were absolutely frying. And like on that Bocage, like for Kleenex and Bance, they were frying early, but overall, Insight and Cammy couldn't get going. It seemed like the ARs just didn't feel comfortable on the map at all, and Dashy and Illy were having them all throughout the map for sure. Like Insight went 20 and 30, and Cammy went 26 and 37. And it was really tough out there. So we're seeing impressive stuff from Bance and Kleenex, but it was weird seeing Insight and Cammy struggle like that. I know it's Bocage, and maybe they're not used to that 2 AR meta yet, or like seeing how these teams are starting to use the 2 ARs on Bocage specifically, because that was my thought after they played OpTic. But then they come out against LA Thieves and absolutely tear them up on Bocage. So there's just a lot of inconsistent signs here, signals from Toronto in the hardpoint category, especially on Bocage. OpTic outplayed them in S&D. And then against LA Thieves, after frying them on Bocage, they just really lost the rhythm. So the question mark is like, did not having Cammy last week affect them in some way in a longer term? Or like, was it just that type of weekend for Toronto where they just weren't clicking fully until we're into like stage 2 or so? It's going to be hard to know who's going to win any map at any time this year. And that's why this major is going to be so insanely interesting. Overall, am I worried? No, but they finished 2 and 3 in their groups, which I don't think anybody saw coming. So there is at least a little bit of room to be concerned with this team. And like I said, it goes to show how insanely competitive the CDL is right now. All right, the third thing, man, OpTic is back. They beat Toronto 3-0. They finally beat the Ultra in the CDL. Obviously, Scump has had his problems against Ultra last year in Cold War. You could see it in the passion from them in the listen-ins that they released afterwards. Like that meant a lot to them. And in that series, Boston just needed to win 1 map to secure themselves a winner's bracket start for Major 1. And OpTic at that point had already clinched a winner's bracket start. So it seemed like they were allowing some of the map pool to play out a little bit and develop some of it. Let them play Gavutu Hardpoint. They let them play Tuscan S&D, which is probably one of Boston's best maps, and they end up beating them in round 11 on Tuscan S&D, which is a really good win. And again, another impressive showing on Tuscan from OpTic. And then they played a Gavutu Control. So there was a lot of interesting map sets here for OpTic. I think we learned a lot about this team. And Illy showed up and played really, really well throughout both the Toronto and Boston series. And OpTic is right back in this as a contender for stage 1. This team clicked a lot sooner than I think a lot of people thought they might after their struggles. And maybe it did have to do with some of that input delay in the hex quarters, because if you guys didn't see that, Formal was talking about how they had like a 5 millisecond delay on the monitors up until this week. Maybe that had something to do with it, because they look like a different team this week and we're absolutely cooking. I love watching Shotzzy play, especially on Tuscan. This dude is all up and down and over and around this map, man. He is flying, so impactful on the map, and hits flanks and wraps back to play with his team. It's just great. I'm a big fan of how Shotzzy plays. All right, so number 4 here, I mean, come on. FaZe is back on top. They went 5-0 in the group stage. Simp was absolutely cooking this weekend. And when we're seeing Simp cook like that, and Celium is playing how he's playing right now, and do you see how Abizi was playing? Oh my word. And not to mention there's this guy named Arcees on their team. It's insane, man. They're just fun to watch because they're just so good. They absolutely fried the Rocker 3-0 in just a fast series, and then beat NYSL 3-1. When you look at their schedule, it wasn't the hardest of schedules. I mean, they beat Paris, they beat LA Thieves, Boston, Minnesota, and NYSL. So obviously 3 of the 4 of those teams are teams who are currently in the bottom 4. So Paris, Minnesota, and NYSL. So they haven't been as tested as some of the other teams. They beat LA Thieves in a really, really nice series. But besides that, you know, we haven't seen them play against like a London or a Seattle or OpTic or Toronto. So obviously that's what we'll all be looking for in the stage 1 major. And they play Breach round 1. If they end up beating the Breach, then they play the winner of OpTic versus Surge. So that's what we're all hoping to see, is a big time match like that in the winners round 2. So FaZe is really, really good. They're already insanely balanced, and they've been working on their map pools, and they're already pretty developed. And specifically, like those Tuscan S&Ds were insane. Like, I'm going to be talking about some of these plays and learn from the pros, but some plays that Abizi was making were disgusting. And then we even saw Simp pull out the sniper for the first time this year on that Tuscan. So they're developing some sniper strats as well. Not to mention some of their patience, like against the Rocker. To break the final hard point against the Rocker was gorgeous. It was a beautiful, beautiful play of patience, and to wait for Celium to get into position. And going into the stage 1 major, I mean, they're probably going to be the favorites. So the 5th and final point here, I mean, this is pretty obvious, but London, and I'll even throw LA Thieves, I mean, they are real deal contenders. These guys are legit. So we have basically 6 teams now. And like, let's say in no particular order, you know, FaZe, LA Thieves, OpTic, Toronto, Surge, and London, who are all like legit top 6 type contenders. And then you even have like Boston, LAG, and like Minnesota looking in. And then you got like Florida, who knows what NYSL can do. And then there's Paris. But overall, like, there's so many competitive teams in the CDL right now. I mean, London's wins this weekend were unbelievably impressive. London beat Seattle 3-1, and we saw like mainstay Slayer Afro in gear. I mean, we'll talk about this on the podcast a lot, and we'll be talking about all the other teams on the podcast as well, so be on the lookout for that. Plus some banger videos coming out this week, no doubt about it. We saw Afro frying. Gizmo still looked great. Obviously Nasty, I think, continues to improve and look better and more consistent, really. And then even Zero, I mean, man, he made some pop-off plays on Tuscan. And you're like, yo, where this is some nasty gun skill here from Zero. So walked away very impressed with London, and then obviously with LA Thieves beating both Toronto and Paris 3-1 each. That team's so balanced. Kenny, he's undoubtedly a top 10 player. I'll be talking about him in a video this week for sure. They're such a diverse team with how the meta is right now, with the automaton in play, with having Octane and Kenny running full-time automatons, and then Draza and Envoy's ability to even use the automaton. They are rocking and rolling. I mean, they got body bagged by LAT on that Bocage, so maybe you hold off on Bocage for a little bit, and maybe they work on it a little bit more heading into the major, but man, they are a dangerous team. And like I said, both those squads have a legit chance to win Major 1. But there it is, guys, the 5 takeaways. Overall, we have some banger matchups here in the first few days of the stage 1 major in 2 weeks. So we got like OpTic v Seattle, LATV Toronto in that rematch. I'm sure Toronto is hyped to hear they get a rematch against LA Thieves. I'm sure that's not what LAT wanted to hear. You'll take what you can get. We'll talk a lot more about that on the podcast the next 2 weeks and some videos leading up to the stage 1 major. Appreciate you guys for watching. Check out this breakdown video. It's a banger. I guarantee it's certified. I'll talk to you guys very soon. I'm out.